We've seen that realism is the view that there is an external world, there is a world external to mind, composed of material substances. Here again, a material substance by hypothesis, ex hypothesi, here again, supposing that there were such a thing. I don't want to beg the question one way or the other because, as we'll see, George Berkeley denies that there's any such thing as a material substance. But ex hypothesi, by hypothesis, if there were such a thing as a material substance, it would be distinct from the sensible properties by which we know it. If it's something external to mind, well, sensible properties, here again like colors, sounds, smells and tastes, hard, cold, hard, soft, hot, cold, rough, smooth. Sensible qualities exist in minds, exist in perceiving subjects. Now, as we saw, Descartes had the idea that, and Locke, as we saw, had the idea that these sensible properties have to be in something. They must inhere in something that persists through change of properties. But what is that something in which they inhere? We've seen that for both Descartes and Locke, the answer is material substance. There is an underlying support of properties that itself is distinct from the sensible properties. That underlying support, or metaphysical substratum of sensible properties, is what the material substance is. Now, we've seen that on Descartes' rationalist approach to indirect realism, substance is grasped by intellect. It's by reason that we discern that the world is composed of things that are distinct from the sensible properties by which we know them. Again, by hypothesis, a material substance would simply be the underlying basis of such sensible properties as those that we associate with physical objects, with corporeal objects, with bodies. Now, consider this point that Descartes touched on. We know a corporeal object by its properties. This was Descartes' point in the example of the wax, right? Consider, for example, a violet. We know it by such things as its color. In the case of violet, the color violet, the color violet, at least of the petals here, green for the stem and leaves. Such properties as that it's a living thing. Such properties as that it's the kind of thing that needs water to live. But here again, what are these properties in? What is the violet itself as distinct from the list of sensible properties or the bundle of sensible properties by which we know it? We can list the properties of, for example, a violet, but the question remains, what is a violet? What are the properties that we list properties of? That is to say, what is the violet in itself as distinct from the sensible properties by which we know it? On the realist view, the thing itself is not identical to any quality or any bundle of qualities. So what is that thing in itself? What are the qualities in? Well, we've seen here again Descartes' rationalist approach to realism is that substance is something that is discerned by the mind, by reason. It's something that is grasped by intellect, not by our senses. We've seen that Locke is also a realist, and so also believes in an external world, believes in the reality of a world external to mind, a world of mind-independent material substances. But as we've seen, Locke also tries to defend empiricism, the thesis that all of our knowledge comes from experience, as well as concept empiricism, the narrower thesis that all of our concepts, all of our ideas come from experience. And I said before that the appeal of nativism is that with respect to some of our ideas, it's hard to see how we would get the idea from experience. Infinity, God, perfection, substance. Here again, such ideas as we have of objects of pure thought, such as the objects of geometry and math, numbers. So nativism, the thesis that there are innate ideas, has always been appealing for that reason. It helps to explain how we could have knowledge in areas where the ideas don't seem to be ideas that could be acquired through experience or derived from any particular experience. And so, corollary to that, the difficulty with empiricism, here again, it's always had a certain appeal as well. Concept empiricism has always been appealing because it seems like it would be a simpler explanation of how we come by our ideas. And here again, simplicity is a virtue in a theory. Occam's razor, here again, simplicity criterion. The simpler theory is more likely to be correct. But the problem, a problem anyway, with concept empiricism is that it then has to give an account of how many of the ideas that we have, well, let me start that again, how all of the ideas that we have trace to experience. But with respect to many of the ideas we have, it's hard to see how they do trace to experience. It doesn't seem like they do. That's why nativism has always been appealing. And when it comes to the concept of substance, Locke acknowledges that we have no very clear account, we have no very clear notion of how that idea comes from experience, which is a difficulty for Locke's view. It's a difficulty for any empiricist version of realism. Because realism is the thesis that a mind-independent world of material substances is something real. But Locke also tries to defend concept empiricism, the thesis that all of our knowledge, all of our ideas come from experience. So it's a tension in his thinking, it's a tension in his thought, if he has to concede, as he does, that it's by no means clear how we could derive the concept of substance from experience. That was Descartes' point in the example of the wax. We know the thing by the set of sensible properties. And in the case of the example of the wax, the bundle of sensible properties undergoes a total change between time 1 and time 2. So how do we know that it's the same thing? Well, we saw that on Descartes' approach. Here again, it's reason, it's mind, it's intellect that discerns the essential nature of the wax itself, which is simply material substance, something with extension, something mutable, something that can undergo change, and something that is extended in space. But these are essential attributes of substance are grasped by reason, that those are the essential attributes that persist through the change of properties as understood by the mind, not by the senses. The senses are just presented with the sensible properties. But here again, Descartes is a rationalist. He can appeal to the innate idea of substance. The idea is already in us, and that's what enables us to make sense of that experience, make sense of experiences like the example of the wax, where the thing undergoes a total change of sensible properties. Locke wants to construct a version of realism that is empiricist, that is to say, makes no appeal to innate ideas. And yet, he has to acknowledge that it's hard to see how we would trace this concept of substance to any experience, since all we ever experience is actually just the sensible properties of physical objects, of bodies. So he acknowledges that. In the essay Concerning Human Understanding, he says, if anyone will examine himself concerning his notion of pure substance in general, he will find that he has no other idea of it at all, but only a supposition of he knows not what support of such qualities. So Locke acknowledges that we have no clear concept of substance that can trace back to experience. Just a vague idea of a support of qualities, but the actual support we never actually experience. We only actually experience the properties. So this is a tension in Locke's thinking, if not indeed a full-blown contradiction. There may be a contradiction at the heart of Locke's empiricist version of indirect realism. Why, on empiricist grounds, should we posit this mysterious I know not what? He acknowledges that we have no clear conception of substance. It's just a mysterious I know not what, he says in the essay. Well then, if you're going to be a consistent empiricist, why not just say that the violet is a certain bundle of sensible qualities? The violet just is the bundle of such properties as violet, green, a certain texture to the petals, a certain texture to the stem, a certain aroma, the bundle of sensible properties that we associate with corporeal objects, that is to say with bodies. That's just what they are. They just are bundles of sensible properties, and the properties are not in anything. If you're going to be a consistent empiricist, then it is arguably the case that that is the metaphysical position that you ought to accept. Why not just say that bodies are bundles of sensible qualities? Bodies just are bundles of sensible properties. That is Berkeley's view. So idealism is the view that the world is mind dependent. As I've put it another way, the world is a mental phenomenon. Or put it another way, the world does not exist outside of minds. There is no world external to sense impressions. Corporeal objects, that is to say bodies, like violets, or dogs, or trees, or houses, or tables, or coffee mugs, they just are bundles of mind-dependent qualities. So here again, such qualities as color, hard or soft, hot or cold, rough or smooth, tastes, flavors, aromas, fragrances. These sensible properties just are what objects are. An object is simply to be identified with a certain bundle of sensible properties, the bundle of sensible properties by which we know it. But here again, sensations don't exist outside of a perceiving mind. Sense impressions don't exist outside of a perceiving mind. But that's all that a sensible property is. It's a certain sense impression. But here again, sense impressions don't exist outside of minds. So if bodies are composed of sense impressions, then bodies do not exist outside of minds. That is to say, the world is mind dependent. The world does not exist outside of minds. So Berkeley's approach to what has come to be called in modern philosophy the external world problem is to, in a sense, to deny the problem. Because he denies that the world is anything external to mind. The world just is a mental phenomenon. Now there's no difficulty in explaining how the mind comes to know the world. The world is a mental phenomenon. So, in the selections that we have from a dialogue that Berkeley wrote, the dialogues between Hylas and Philoneus. Here again, this is a dialogue much like what we saw in Hume, much like Hume's dialogues on natural religion, where in the case of Hume's dialogue, as we saw, the character Philo was really was really an instrument for Hume to get across his views. Similarly, in the dialogues between Hylas and Philoneus, Philoneus is the character that represents Berkeley's views. And much of the argument for idealism, at least as it's presented by Berkeley, much of the argument for phenomenalism, is that this indirect realist approach is implausibly complicated. There is in that metaphysics, in Locke's metaphysics, there is a suspicious twofold nature to everything. There's a suspect or a suspicious duplication. There's a twofold to objects. In Locke's metaphysics, as we've seen, and here again, I'm focusing mainly on Berkeley's criticisms of Locke. Locke is not the only realists that we've looked at. But Berkeley is the next major figure in the empiricist tradition, that tradition in British philosophy that begins from the principle that all knowledge derives from experience and all of our ideas come from experience. That is Berkeley's view as well. So Berkeley is Locke's successor in the empiricist tradition. And so much of Berkeley's critique focuses on his predecessor in the empiricist tradition. And what he finds wrong with Locke's version of empiricism, the indirect realist version of empiricism, is that there's a twofold nature to the objects of our experience, which Berkeley finds implausibly complicated. That's an implausibly complicated, an extravagant theory, according to Berkeley. Here again, everything else being equal, the simpler theory is more likely to be correct, and Berkeley is arguing that it would be simpler if objects just were bundles of the sensible qualities by which we know them, and the world just were a mental phenomenon. There isn't anything on the other side of the sense impressions that is the thing in itself. The thing in itself is what is given to us in experience. That's just what it is. What is given to us in perception is what the thing is. There isn't any mysterious underlying metaphysical support for the sensible properties by which we know a body. The body just is the set of sensible properties. That's the phenomenalist view or idealist view. On Berkeley's view, the mind is directly aware of sense impressions. I'm directly aware of the color of the desk before me, for example. I'm directly aware of its color. I'm directly aware of the smoothness of its surface. I'm directly aware of the hardness of it. And this bundle of sense impressions just is what the desk is. The mind is directly aware of sense impressions. The problem with Locke's view, according to Berkeley, is that Locke then posits an unobservable counterpart to the impression, a mysterious thing in itself, that is the quote-unquote real thing. Berkeley finds that implausible. They both agree that the mind is directly aware of sense impressions, but then Berkeley believes that's all that there is to the object. That's all that there is to corporeal objects. There is no such thing as a material substance, understood as an underlying metaphysical substratum or support of sensible properties. According to Berkeley, there isn't any unobservable counterpart, something on the other side of the sense impressions that is the thing itself. The thing itself just is the sense impressions by which we know it, the set of sense impressions by which we know it. The color of an apple, the red color, the texture of it, the taste of it, the fragrance of it, all these kinds of sensible properties by which we know it, they just are what the apple is. The apple itself is not anything distinct from that bundle of sensible properties. Here again, sensible properties, sense impressions, do not exist outside of minds. Therefore, corporeal objects, things like apples, things like desks, tables, chairs, cups, trees, they don't exist outside of minds. So much of Berkeley's argument for idealism focuses on his critique of the Lockean notion of substance. And he thinks that the error in philosophy has been to think that the world is something distinct from what is given to us in experience. As Berkeley sees it, that has been the characteristic mistake of his precursors, of his predecessors in philosophy. He thinks that opening up this gap between the object of experience on the one hand And the real object, on the other hand, the quote-unquote real object, the thing in itself that is somehow mysteriously on the other side of our sense impressions, he thinks that opening up that gap, that's the root of skepticism. That's how the skeptical problem arises. The skeptical problem, the worry that maybe we don't know anything about the world, maybe the mind doesn't know anything about the world, maybe the world is radically different from the way that it's given to us in experience. That skeptical worry is rooted in this mistaken notion in philosophy, according to Berkeley, here again it's mistaken, that reality is something distinct from what we experience. That bodies are something unobservable on the other side of the sense impressions by which we know bodies. That right there is the root of skepticism. That's the cause of skepticism, according to Berkeley. Berkeley does not see himself as a skeptic. He sees himself as the defender of common sense. He takes it as given that we do have knowledge of all the mundane, familiar objects in the physical world around us. Tables and chairs, houses, trees, and so forth. We do have knowledge of these things. We do know about these. We do know these things. We do know how they are. The way that they're given to us in experience is the way that they are. But here again, the sense impressions by which we know them, sensible qualities, are sensations. They are sense impressions, and sensations do not exist outside of minds. Therefore, all those familiar objects in the physical world around us, they are mental phenomena. The only way to defend the common sense view that we have knowledge of these kinds of things is to concede that they are mental phenomena. Bodies are composed of ideas. Ideas are psychological items. Ideas, that is to say, ideas do not exist outside of minds. Therefore, physical objects are mental phenomena. They do not exist outside of minds. The world is a mental phenomenon. So, the root of skepticism and the problem with indirect realism, the reason that indirect realism cannot resolve the skeptical worry that maybe we don't have any knowledge of the world, is it mistakenly opens up this gap between the object of experience and the object in reality, the object of experience and the so-called thing in itself. So positing this mysterious, unobservable counterpart to the sense impression, the substance, positing that as the real thing, that's the cause of skepticism. That's the path that, in Berkeley's view, has been a wrong turn in philosophy. Our knowledge of the world can only be defended on the supposition that the world is a mental phenomenon, that the familiar objects in the physical world around us are bundles of sense impressions. But sense impressions here again don't exist outside of perceiving subjects. Therefore, the world, the familiar physical objects, the corporeal objects in the world around us, they are all mental phenomena. They do not exist outside of minds. Berkeley's view is that we do have knowledge. We know things about trees and dogs and rocks and rivers, etc. But here again, we cannot know anything about unobservable entities outside of the mind, which here again is what a material substance would be if there were such a thing. Berkeley denies that there is such a thing. The only true substances on Berkeley's view are spiritual substances, the kind of substances that we are essentially, what we saw Descartes call thinking substance. That is the only true substance, according to Berkeley. Only spiritual substances, or thinking substances, or mental substance, call it what you will. Those are the only true substances. There's only one kind of thing, spiritual substances. That's the idealist view, the phenomenalist view. Or, more strictly speaking, there just are spiritual substances and the ideas that exist in them. So the mundane objects in the world around us, the physical world around us, like trees, dogs, rocks, rivers, they are mental phenomena. And that is proven by the fact that we have knowledge of such things. We would not be able to have any knowledge of them if what they really were unobservable entities external to the mind, outside of the mind. So the source of skepticism about our knowledge of bodies lies in thinking that there's something external to mind. They're not. Bodies only exist in minds. Bodies do not exist outside of minds. That's the phenomenalist view. That's the idealist view. In the dialogues between Hylas and Philoneus, here again, Philoneus is the character who is kind of a vehicle for Berkeley to get across his own ideas. The literal sense of the name Philoneus is lover of mind, so that tells you what the view is that here again Berkeley is trying to get across. His view is that only minds are substances. Minds are the only true substances. Spiritual substance, thinking substance, mental substance, call it what you will, is the only true kind of substance. There's no such thing as material substance. A material substance by hypothesis would be an underlying supportive qualities that is distinct from the thing perceived. And that is the real thing. Bodies are mental phenomena. Bodies do not exist outside of minds. That is Berkeley's view. Hence, the character he uses to get across his views in this dialogue is Philoneus, lover of mind. The other character is Hylas, and Hylas is the word in Greek for matter. So, matter is the name of Philoneus's interlocutor, and in a sense, Berkeley is literally attacking matter. He denies that bodies are material substances. Bodies are bundles of sense impressions. Bodies are bundles of ideas, and ideas do not exist outside of minds. Therefore, bodies are mental phenomena. Mental phenomena. So we have some selections from the dialogues between Hylas and Philoneus, and Philoneus asks Hylas, his interlocutor, shall we therefore examine which of us it is that denies the reality of sensible things, or professes the greatest ignorance of them? Since if I take you rightly, he is to be esteemed the greatest skeptic. So the dialogue begins with Hylas and Philoneus meeting up, and Hylas says something along the lines of, I was at a social gathering last night, and people started talking about you, and they started saying that your view was that there is no world outside of mind. How can you defend a kind of radical skepticism about our knowledge of the world? And Philoneus' reply is that I'm not the skeptic. I'm the one saying that the world is the bundle of sense impressions that are directly present to the mind. Now, because they cannot exist outside of the mind, I believe that the world is a mental phenomenon. So I do believe that there is no world external to mind, but I'm not the skeptic. Berkeley again sees himself as the defender, the champion of common sense. We do have knowledge of such things as trees and rocks and rivers and dogs and tables and chairs. We do know these things. But we could not know them if what they really were was something external to mind, distinct from the sense impressions by which we know them. So here again, on Philoneus' way, on Berkeley's way of understanding things, Philoneus/Berkeley is not the skeptic. The dialogue begins with Philoneus retorting that I'm not the skeptic. Once you rightly understand my position, you'll have to acknowledge that you're the skeptic. So here again, early on in our selections, Philoneus says, shall we therefore examine which of us it is that denies the reality of sensible things, or professes the greatest ignorance of them, since, wrong way. Since if I take you rightly, he is to be esteemed the greatest skeptic. So in so many words, I'm not the skeptic, you're the skeptic. I'm not the skeptic because, here again, I do not profess ignorance of sensible things. I'm the one who is saying that we do have knowledge of sensible things. It's the philosopher who says that the sensible thing is something distinct from what is given to us in perception. He's the one professing that we have a great ignorance of sensible things. I'm not the skeptic. So here again, phenomenalism, idealism, as Berkeley understands it, is a defense of common sense, is a defense of our knowledge of physical objects, of corporeal objects, of the familiar items of the physical world around us. Philonous is not, to his own way of thinking, a skeptic, because he does not deny the existence of sensible objects. He denies that their existence is anything external to mind. So again, Berkeley's view is that if you're going to defend the proposition that we have knowledge of sensible objects, then you have to deny that they are anything external to mind, which just amounts to saying that there is no world external to minds. The world is a mental phenomenon. Objects are composed of ideas. The physical world is composed of ideas. Again, ideas are psychological items. They don't exist outside of minds. So if you're going to defend the proposition that we have knowledge of the sensible world, you have to concede, you have to begin from the supposition that the sensible world is a mental phenomenon. Philonous says if you take away all sensible qualities, there remains nothing sensible. Sensible things, therefore, are nothing else but so many sensible qualities, or combinations of sensible qualities. So again, my example of a violet at the outset. Combination of sensible qualities such as the violet color of the petals, the green color of the stem, the aroma of it, the texture of it, that is to say the way that it feels, smooth in the case of the petals, rough in the case of the stem, rough and smooth. All the sensible qualities by which we know the thing just is what the violet is. It's not anything distinct from the sense impressions. The body just is the bundle of sense impressions. The bundle of sensible qualities is what it is. Now, here again, on Berkeley's view, the only true substances are spiritual substances. The only true substances are minds. Now, a spiritual substance is not a physical substance. So he's not saying that everything that exists only in virtue of being perceived. He's saying that everything that exists is either a perceiver, that's what you and I are essentially, we're spiritual substances that perceive, or if it's not that, if it's not a spiritual substance, then it's something that exists in spiritual substances, namely bundles of sensible ideas. So Philonous says, I speak with regard to sensible things only. And of these I ask, whether by their real existence you mean a subsistence exterior to the mind and distinct from being perceived. And we've seen that that is the realist view, right? Both Descartes and Locke, they say that the real existence of a material substance is something distinct from its being perceived. As we saw, for Locke, secondary qualities are not really in, at least not as they are perceived, not as they are sensible ideas that we experience. The red that we see, for example, is not actually in bodies. That's just in us. And we saw Descartes say much the same thing. Descartes doesn't use this term primary qualities, secondary qualities, but we saw Descartes say much the same thing. The sensible qualities by which we know, many of the sensible qualities by which we know a physical object, do not exist outside of us. Here again, for Locke, we did see that our ideas of primary qualities, like size, shape, extension, motion or rest, these are intrinsic to the body. These are intrinsic to sensible objects. But many of the sensible qualities by which we know a thing only exist in the mind, do not exist outside of the mind. So in the dialogues between Hillas and Philonous, we see Berkeley use a number of arguments to show that the ideas by which we know a thing could not exist in a material substance. That is to say, could not exist in something external to mind, distinct from being perceived. Something that by hypothesis would be distinct from what we perceive. And Berkeley makes that argument not just for what Locke would call secondary qualities, but for all qualities. Any quality is a sense impression. Any quality is a sensible idea. But here again, sense impressions, ideas, sensations are psychological items. They don't exist outside of minds. And if the real thing, so to speak, the material substance, were something distinct from the sensible properties themselves, or the underlying supportive properties that the sensible properties are in, then we wouldn't be able to know physical objects. So Berkeley runs through these arguments for lots of different qualities. In the case here again of tactile ideas like hot and cold, we see the same argument that we saw earlier. We see Philonous use this argument that pain and heat are really the same sensation, just in different degrees. And nobody thinks that the pain is in the fire, therefore you shouldn't think that the heat is in the fire. And once it gets Hillas to concede that the sensation of an intense degree of heat just is the sensation of a certain kind of pain, and once it gets Hillas to concede that pain does not exist outside of minds, which everyone acknowledges, that's uncontroversial, Philonous proceeds to argue that every sense impression has a certain phenomenal character. Here again, the phenomenal character of the sensation of heat is just the way that heat feels, the way that it feels to feel something hot. There's a certain qualitative character, or phenomenal character as it's sometimes called. A certain something that it's like. There is something that it's like to feel a warm sensation or to feel a hot sensation. Just as there's something that it's like to notice a particular shade of blue, or something that it's like to inhale the aroma of coffee. Say, for example, the distinctive aroma of walking into a Starbucks. There's something that it's like to be in that mental state. There's a qualitative character, a phenomenal character to every perceptual state that we're in. In the case of an intense degree of heat, the phenomenal character is what we call pain. And here again, everyone acknowledges that pain doesn't exist outside of mind. But then to be consistent, one has to concede that because every sense impression has a certain phenomenal character, and what it's like to have that experience doesn't exist outside of an experiencing subject, therefore those properties don't exist outside of minds. There's something that it's like to feel warmth. There's something that it's like to feel cold. There's something that's like to feel heat. There's something that it's like to taste a particular sweetness, the sweetness of a strawberry or the sweetness of a blueberry. There's a phenomenal character to all these perceptual states, but here again, the what it's like, the qualitative character or the qualitative content or the phenomenal character, as it's also called, of the sense impression, of the perception, is not something that exists outside of minds. There isn't anything that it's like, let me start that again, the what it's like to inhale the distinctive aroma of Starbucks is not something that exists outside of any experiencing subject, is not something that exists outside of any perceiving mind. So to be consistent, we have to allow that all sense impressions are mental phenomena. They do not exist outside of minds. So this goes for all the sensible qualities by which we know a thing. Phenomenal character, the what it's like, is clearly in the mind. it can't be in what Philonuus calls a senseless being. Here again, we saw Descartes distinguish between thinking substance, which is the kind of substance that we are, and then on the other side of the dualist divide, right, material substance. A material substance, by hypothesis, if such a thing existed. I don't want to beg the question here again because Berkeley denies that material substances exist. But if there were such a thing, ex hypothesi, a material substance would be a senseless being, something that sensible properties are in, but that it's not capable of perceiving sensible properties. To Berkeley, that just makes no sense. So Philonuus tries in various ways, Hillos tries in various ways to defend the indirect realist view according to which the sense impression is really something external to mind. So with respect to sounds, for example, says that, well, sounds are really just vibrations in the air. Here again, if a sound is a certain sense impression cannot be in a senseless being, which is, here again, what a material substance would be. Something that sensible properties are in, but that does not perceive sensible properties. So if by vibrations of air, Philonuus says, you mean something outside of sensation, then we're not talking about sound. That can't be what sound really is. There is something that it's like to be in the experiential state of perceiving sound. There is something that it's like. There is this phenomenal character to it. There is something that it's like to notice the distinctive sound of an oboe, say, for example. But that what it's like, that qualitative character to the experience, cannot exist outside of a mind. Therefore, sound is not something that exists outside of mind. Therefore, to try to identify it with what would be, by hypothesis, senseless beings, vibrations in air, understood as something existing outside of minds, that cannot be what sound is. Sound cannot be identified with something external to mind. Philonuus asks, how can sound, being a sensation, exist in the air? If by the air you mean a senseless substance existing without the mind, that is to say, existing outside of the mind. Sound is a sense impression. Sense impressions do not exist outside of minds. Therefore, sound cannot be identified with something external to minds. That's the phenomenalist view. That's the idealist view. That is Berkeley's view. Here again, colors, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations like hot, cold, hard, soft, rough, smooth. They do not exist outside of minds. And that's all that bodies are. They're just bundles of those sensible properties. Therefore, bodies do not exist outside of minds. Philonuus in criticizing, here again, Philonuus and Hillos keep going back and forth on this issue of material substance. Hillos trying to defend the thesis that the real thing is something that the sensible properties are in, as distinct from the perception of the objects. Philonuus says, in saying each visible object has that color which we see in it, you make visible objects to be corporeal substances, which implies that corporeal substances are sensible qualities, or else that there is something besides sensible qualities perceived by sight. But your corporeal substance is nothing distinct from the sensible qualities. In the selections from the dialogue that we have, Philonuus keeps pressing this line of argument. What is the body? What is the corporeal object? And Hillos keeps trying to make it out to be something distinct from the sensible qualities by which we know it. So the real physical object, by hypothesis, would be something that isn't given to us directly in perception, isn't directly perceived by sight, for example. So Philonuus argues, look, are the colors in the object or not? And Hillas at times will concede that colors are properties, for example. I mean, here again, they go through this for all the different kinds of sensible qualities, but just to take the example of color, Hillas concedes that colors are in objects. Here again, Philonuus's reply is that colors are perceived by sight and cannot exist outside of perception. So if the colors really are in the object, then the object is the bundle of qualities that are presented in perception, in sensible experience. Bodies are not anything distinct from sensible qualities. And here again, sensible qualities do not exist outside of minds. So the real thing, so to speak, can't be something distinct from what we perceive. That's the line of argument that Philonuus keeps pressing. Is the real thing something distinct from what we perceive? Philonuus tries to say that it is. And then Philonuus gets him to concede that things like colors are in the objects. But colors do not exist outside of perception. A color that cannot be seen makes no sense, according to Berkeley. And to say that the real thing is something on the other side of what is seen makes no sense either. If colors are in objects, and colors do not exist outside of minds, then the objects are mental phenomena. They are bundles of sense impressions, bundles of sensible qualities, not anything distinct from sensible qualities. That's what objects are. That's what bodies are. Corporeal objects are mental phenomena. They are bundles of ideas. That's Berkeley's view. So an advantage of idealism is that it does well by the simplicity criterion. It's an economical view. It avoids, for example, the problems associated with substance dualism. In defending dualism, Descartes depends on, as we saw, the premise that material substance on the one hand, which is something by hypothesis external to mind, and spiritual substance, which is what we are essentially, those two interact. But the thesis that a spiritual substance and a material substance interact, according to Berkeley, there's no sense to be made of that thesis. They're in completely different metaphysical categories. How could the one kind of thing interact with the other? Again, a physical object, a material substance, by hypothesis, would be something external to mind. How could a spiritual substance, something immaterial, come to know something material? It's very difficult to make sense of this notion that mind and matter interact. And so one advantage of idealism is that it avoids this difficulty. Here again, it's difficult to make sense of interaction between something immaterial and something material. That is the thesis. That is the premise that substance dualism depends on, or at least Descartes' version of it, I should say. Cartesian dualism specifically depends on the thesis that spiritual substance and material substance can interact. But the problem with that, a basic metaphysical objection to that, is that we don't have any clear conception of what that comes to. What does it come to say that something immaterial could act on something material? We have no conception of what that comes to. Let me get the point across this way. Let's take a candidate for something uncontroversial, a kind of mundane example of something that is immaterial, something that is uncontroversially not a material thing, immaterial. So, say for example, a number. A number is not a physical thing. A number is not a material thing, right? The number 7, say for example, is not a material thing. Well, we can't conceive of any way in which the number 7 could causally interact with a material world. Can you bang on the desk with the number 7? No. The number 7 can't do anything because it's an immaterial object of pure thought. It can't do anything to the material world, can it? You can't use it to say bang on the desk, say for example. You can't kick it, say for example. It's not a material thing. You can't use it to drive a nail or something like that. It can't interact with the material world because it's an immaterial thing. I take it that much is uncontroversial, right? And conversely, the material world cannot in any way act on an object of pure thought, like a number. So can you eat the number 7? No. Can you alter it in any way? Is there any physical process by which you can alter its essential properties? By banging on the number 7, can you change it from odd to even? No. Can you strip off the property in virtue of which it's prime? No. Will the number 7 be even tomorrow? Could it be altered by some physical operation, something physical that you could do to it? No, it's an object of pure thought. It's an immaterial thing. There isn't anything that you could do to it physically because it's not a physical thing. So a number is an uncontroversial example of something that's not material. So there are immaterial things. That's not the problem. It's uncontroversial that a number, say for example, is not a physical object. Or propositions, say for example, are not material objects. The proposition that it is raining, say for example, is not a material object. It's not a physical object. We might express it with physical signs, like letters written on a piece of paper or on a chalkboard, something like that. But the proposition itself is not to be identified, cannot be identified with the letters, right? If that were true, then it wouldn't be possible for the proposition to be expressed in different languages, right? So the proposition, it is raining, say for example, in German you would say es regnet. In French the expression is il pleut. In Spanish the expression is hay lluvia. Those are all different combinations of symbols. The proposition itself is not something that can be identified with any sentence of a natural language, like English or French or German or Spanish, is it? They all express the same proposition. But what is the proposition itself? The proposition itself can't be identified with any of those strings of symbols, can it? Because they all express the same proposition. So numbers, here again, are uncontroversially immaterial. Propositions, again, it's not controversial that those are not material things. So there are immaterial things. The problem for substance dualism is we have no conception of what it would come to say that something material acts on something immaterial or vice versa. How could any physical process alter an immaterial thing? And here again, conversely, how could you act on the world in a physical way with an immaterial object? You couldn't bang on the desk with a proposition, or with a concept, or with a belief, or with a number. So my point in all this is that we have no conception of what it would be for something material and something immaterial to interact. There's no non-controversial example that you can point to. Of course, you can say, oh, well, the mind and the body. The mind is not a physical thing and the body is, and the two interact. But the problem is that's a controversial example, and it's controversial because there aren't any non-controversial examples that you can give. Therefore, many people are skeptical, many philosophers have been skeptical, that that is the correct account of the relation between mind and body. If that were true, then apparently it would be a one-of-a-kind case. That is to say, the relation between mind and body would be a unique case, would be a one-of-a-kind case, would be a sui generis case, to use this Latin term for one-of-a-kind. Which maybe it is. Perhaps it is. But typically, in any branch of inquiry, not just philosophy, science, any branch of inquiry, if something is an anomaly, there's only one thing that is that way, there's nothing else like it, that typically is reason to be suspicious that we have the right account of the phenomenon in question. In this case, the phenomenon under consideration is the relation between the mind and the world. If it's a case of an immaterial thing interacting with a material thing, then it's apparently a one-of-a-kind case. There's nothing else like it, which here again at the end of the day may be true, but maybe substance dualism is right. But it has prompted many readers, many thinkers, just many people in general, to doubt it, because there aren't any non-controversial examples of that you can point to, which suggest that maybe we don't have the correct conception of the relation between mental and physical, between mind and body, between mind and world. How can mind and body interact if mind is a material thinking substance and body is material substance? That's the problem for Cartesian dualism. How could the one kind of thing act on something that is categorically different? Again, Berkeley doesn't have that problem because he denies that there are any material substances. There are only spiritual substances. Immaterial thinking substance is the only true substance. So an advantage of Berkeley's idealism is it doesn't have this problem. It doesn't have the problem of explaining how mind and world interact, because the world is a mental phenomenon. It doesn't exist outside of minds. Now, Berkeley's view is not that the world is simply identical with your mind. So this is a common misunderstanding of Berkeley. Common misunderstanding would be that he's defending solipsism, the view that only the contents of one's own mind exist. That's not what he's saying. If that were true, then idealism would entail the implausible thesis that when I close my eyes, for example, the tree, for example, goes out of existence. So Hillas uses that argument against Philoneus in the dialogue, but Philoneus replies that that's not his view. So Berkeley is not defending solipsism. He's not saying that the world is identical with the contents of one's own mind. The world is not to be identified with your mind, say, for example. He's saying that the world does not exist outside of minds. That's a different thesis. That's saying that the world is a mental phenomenon. It's a bundle of ideas, and ideas don't exist outside of minds. But he's not saying that the world therefore depends on any one mind. It doesn't depend on my mind or your mind, for example. According to Berkeley, corporeal objects are ideas in the mind of God. Their being in God's mind is the reason for their continued existence when they aren't present to my mind. So Berkeley agrees that even though, well, let me put it this way. Berkeley agrees that when you're not perceiving the tree, it still exists. But he thinks that that is consistent with saying that The tree, for example, does not exist outside of minds, because the infinite mind of God, the omniscient mind of God, perceives all regions of the universe at all times. So the world doesn't depend on your mind for its existence. And objects do not depend on your mind to endure, to persist. They persist in virtue of the fact that they're always present to some minds. At the very least, they are always present to the infinite mind of God, the omniscient mind of God. An infinite substance, God, is the ultimate source of the ideas present to my mind. My mind is a finite substance. Your mind is a finite substance. It has a beginning in time. It's limited in its powers of comprehension. God is the source of all the ideas that make up the phenomenal world. And some of them are available to finite minds like ourselves in a partial, limited way. The total collection of ideas that any object is, that any particular object is, the total collection of ideas that the world is always directly perceived by God. We might have to come to know some of the ideas of an object in stages. So we know that apples are red, say for example. To come to a deeper knowledge of other of the ideas that compose that object, we would have to analyze the body. So we could, in the case of an apple, cut it in half and then see that on the inside it's white, and see such tactile properties as hard that attach to the seeds, and see the color of the seeds. Here again, see the white of the inside of the apple. All of those are ideas too. But our coming to know all of the ideas of which a body is composed would be a kind of progression. And in fact, we're finite substances, so we never can come to know all of them. But all of the ideas of which a body is composed are always known immediately by the omniscient mind of God, an infinite spiritual substance in which all of the ideas that compose the world exist.